Feeling digitally overwhelmed? So much of our communication these days happens virtually, which inherently feels more performative and high pressure. If you're already prone to imposter syndrome, you may feel even more like a fraud in these environments. But it doesn't have to be this challenging. This week, I'm talking with Craig Mattson, professor of communication at Calvin University, who shares his research on work culture in our digital age, which inspired his book, Digital Overwhelm, a mid-career guide to coping at work. Here we discuss the added stresses and self-doubts that come with communicating virtually. We also explore strategies to maintain confidence, leverage our existing strengths, and communicate with greater intentionality. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Menninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Craig. It is so great to have you here today, and I'd love to start by inviting you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
I have a Shih Tzu who's an introvert. So that feels like an important fact to start with. A little black Ewok of a dog. And I'm sometimes mystified as to why he doesn't, his name is Chaucer, why he doesn't like walking as much as I see other dogs out there. But he's also a reminder to me of just like the various ways we experience the world. So my story, you could start with my dog. I think about Chaucer a lot. My wife and I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I'm a professor at Calvin University, and I teach courses in communication and media production and strategic communication sort of stuff, and my wife works in the healthcare industry. So I'm really delighted to be in this conversation with you and to think about some of the connections between my research and your listeners' experience and my experience of imposter syndrome.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you here, and I'm really excited to dive into the research. I know that you have written a book recently, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about what your research is in, right? And then just tell us a little bit more about what you see as the connection between what you're doing and imposter syndrome more broadly.
Yes, we might have to tunnel towards each other on that, but I don't think it will be too hard. So, what is my research in was your first question. And I guess I pay a lot of attention to organizational communication. I started in, teaching and scholarship in a field called rhetoric, which has to do with like how we come to be persuaded of something or persuade others of things. But through the course of researching various kinds of corporate attempts to do good in the world, and then smaller business attempts like social enterprise attempts to do good in the world, I really became interested in organizational dynamics. Like constantly in an organization, we are interacting on what seems like just a one-on-one basis, or maybe a one-on-three or something like that. But very often, there's this other sort of shadowy presence in all of our conversations that is the organization, and trying to make sure that this conversation we're having, manager to team member, is also a part of that larger conversation of like what's happening in our organization is really fascinating. But my research in the last few years has shifted, I think as we all have, to thinking about hybridity. Like, what is it like to do work in partially virtual, partially in-person spaces? And so my book, Digital Overwhelm, really is an exploration of work culture in digital life today.
Which is so timely, obviously, and so important. And I have this conversation all the time, whether it's personally or professionally, that the inherent challenges of building connection, communicating, etc., when you are in a hybrid type of model. And I know there are a lot of people listening who do not want to go back to the office. There's a big battle over that. But
Oh
I think
yeah.
we have to acknowledge that there are things that are harder. There are, if we're not in the same space together. And so I'd love
Hmm.
to hear a little bit about what you see as the biggest sort of what I don't want to frame it in a negative way, but what does your research reveal about the nature of communication given this changing structure?
Hmm. I I think maybe I'll start with a story. So I'm thinking about a research participant named Brittany, who I connected with. This was my did my research in the middle of the pandemic, and I connected with her. She had just switched jobs, a very familiar experience for people during the Great Resignation, and she was dealing with a whole new company, doing sort of marketing work, and she didn't really know anybody in the company and had never met anybody in the company. And so she found herself staring into her screen, trying to discern the cues and the signals from the faces and the chat in meetings. What do they really want? What are their goals? What do they care about? When are they joking and when are they being in earnest? And all of that was made quite challenging in that sort of remote work environment. I imagine that she has now, like so many of us, gone into a hybrid arrangement like you're describing, where you're partially in person and partially at home. And that seems like, in some ways, a sweet spot, like a good development. But there are always trade-offs, and that those trade-offs aren't always apparent. We're all kind of like doing this major experiment right now in work culture, and some of us are really hopeful about this, and some of us are despairing about that. But I think, as far as imposter syndrome, I neglected to try to make a connection with that. But I think that digital work, or working in digital spaces, is probably a better way to put it, compels us to be performative in good and bad ways. So there's a sense in which if you're on a call and you want it to be a good call, you really have to exert a lot of energy, vocal energy, facial energy. I think it's probably a good idea to stand up for meetings as much as you can, to just sort of try to invest your whole self in this remote meeting. But that is taxing. And that kind of performance can also aggravate your sense of imposterness because you just feel the artifice of it. You feel, am I being fake right now? How do I be genuine in this space? And you're also really super conscious of like the on stage and the backstage because you're thinking about your background and literally, and you're thinking about what's just off camera and you're wondering how you're coming off. And so if you do have some uncertainty, like so many of us do, it can be really challenging to deal with the sort of psychological and even spiritual aspects of work when you're like already dealing with a sense of your own imposterdom or whatever you want to call that. I think that digital makes that more intense. It can.
I agree with you, and I'm curious if you feel that this is heightened pressure from pressure that we already feel like when we're in the same physical space, or do you think it's fundamentally different? Do you think that because I think that there's probably a performative aspect of all workplace communication because we are,
That's true.
right? But
Good point.
certainly when you introduce digital tools, it
Hmm.
it sort of magnifies
Hmm.
that experience or that pressure.
That dimension of it.
Hmm.
Yeah, maybe in person, some of us anyway can forget about the performance stuff. I remember talking with a woman who worked in LA in the film industry, and she talked about the complexities of being a woman in an in-person physical space. So the just proximity issues. If somebody sort of leans over your shoulder to look at a screen that you're both working on, there are angles that can be uncomfortable, and there can be things that maybe your male colleagues aren't thinking about in terms of proximity. Or you might have some kind of past experience that makes you uneasy about your in-person quote unquote performance. And so I think some people maybe can forget about it, like the dudes in the office maybe sometimes can. But then there may be people who, for various aspects of their identity, it's just like impossible for them to forget that, oh, this is I'm on stage here in a certain way. So yeah, I do. And so in that sense, Kim, it's strange. Like the digital can be a reprieve because you have. I remember talking with someone who was non-binary, and they were talking about how remote meetings were just, it was a little bit easier to navigate some of the complexities of being who they are with colleagues who might be either respectful of their pronouns or might not be. But in any case, the remote meeting was in some ways an easier space to deal with. So it's a give and take thing for sure. There's endless things we could talk about in that regard.
No, I think you bring up a good point because the hybrid environment or sort of the communication via digital tools creates a natural boundary that may be harder
Hmm.
to navigate in an actual physical space.
Yeah,
At the
yeah.
same time, that boundary may make it more challenging for some people because of the reasons that you're talking about, of like, I feel this added pressure to perform or to show up in
Hmm.
a certain way. Or even I think,
Hmm.
especially if you're talking about a more crowded space like a meeting, you
Yeah.
have to take extra steps to be visible in that kind of a space if you're one of just a number of boxes on a screen,
Oh, right,
right?
right, right, right.
As opposed to being in a room with other people where you may be able
Mhm.
to more naturally be more visible. So,
Right. I was just thinking, just naturally be there. Yes, I like that. I think that's a good point. And if you have a sense of imposter syndrome, you might, at least in my experience, let me ask this of you, Kim. Like, if you have a sense of like, ugh, do I belong here? Do you feel more determined to prove that you belong there? And so you do try to stand out in all the squares in the Zoom room? Or do you think that you might be kind of happy to just be a square in on the screen? What do you think about that?
that's a very good question. I tend to see more of the hiding behaviors, so I think that it
Hmm.
does create a bit of an escape for people. You can kind of keep your camera off. You can, play smaller if you're in that digital space. However, there are people who tend to overcompensate in the way that you're talking about, and maybe they actually work that much harder to try to prove themselves, and
Hmm.
that might be interrupting other people or doubling down on ideas or
Right,
things that
right,
are a
right.
little bit more aggressive. Um, Honestly, I think that that is where imposter syndrome shows up differently between men and women because of the way we're
Hmm.
socially conditioned. I think, men are
Yeah,
conditioned to not appear as weak. And so if they struggle with insecurities and self-doubt, they may be more likely to want to plow through them.
right.
Whereas
That
women,
sounds right.
women have a tendency to just, we were taught as children to be obedient, to, follow the rules. And if we don't know how to play the game, we're more likely to just kind of sit on the sidelines, quiet.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes, that sounds right to me. And I think that gender lens is really useful for thinking about the different ways we deal with our own insecurities. My book, Digital Overwhelm, explores 6 ways that people cope with the too muchness of the workplace. And I think for many people that sense of like overwhelm is related to their their own sense of competence. Like, can I actually do this? It might be because the job just asks too much of you. Your inbox is just way too stuffed. It might be because of your formation and your upbringing, that you're always wondering, like, am I up for this? But yeah, I mean, people deal with this sense of my smallness and the world's overwhelm, in different ways. And it was really interesting to see that sometimes people deal with that sense of overwhelm through, we need to have a one-on-one conversation. Like
Mhm.
that will give some control here. And other people might respond with a less is more sort of approach. I talked about that in terms of signaling. And those people might say, like, let me be minimalist in this space. That's the best way for me to deal with my excessive feelings. And other people really try to take control of the situation by, you know, I called it sending things. So maybe like writing a super huge email to quote unquote get everybody on the same page. And then you have the people who deal by becoming overt advocates, outspoken arguers or persuaders for things. I love all of these modes, and they all have gifts that come with them. My basic recommendation was like, don't get stuck in any one of them. Practice a certain kind of flexibility. I think learning what really does help you in the workplace. Probably one or two or three of these modes are probably going to actually help you feel satisfied about your work and meet your goals. Sticking to just one of them, not so much.
I think that's a really important point too. And one of the things that's coming up for me as you're saying that is there's this double-edged nature to
Mm.
what you're describing, which is it's a learnable skill, which I think makes people feel more
Oh,
encouraged, right? Like, oh, I
I
don't have to
do
be
this.
naturally gifted at this in order to be able to
Yeah.
shift or flex my style. On the other hand, I do think if you're already struggling with confidence issues around your
Hmm.
competence, it feels
Oh,
like
yeah.
one more thing that I don't know how to
Yeah.
do. Right?
Yeah. I think I think my book was not so much trying to say, here's a whole new set of skills you need to cultivate. Because I feel that aversion as well. I already feel like there are enough skills I need to cultivate, enough new platforms to master, and new passwords to remember, and new things to put under my competencies list on my resume. Oh gosh. So yes, totally agree with that. I think in some ways, what I was trying to do in my book, I said that there were like 6 ways that people cope. After each chapter, I include like a half chapter, and it's called a mode switch workshop. But what I'm doing there is not so much saying like, here's a totally new thing you should become a ninja at. Instead, I'm saying, here are things you know how to do, but let's bring them out of the realm of like what I know how to do, but I never talk about, and let's talk about them. Let's bring them into the articulate and the explicit. And in some ways, it was just like, let's recover things that you know how to do instinctively, intuitively, and let's actually make those the focus of our attention for a half chapter. And so my hope is that people come out of that feeling empowered, like, oh yeah, like I am kind of awesome at that. I can do that intuitively. I just had sort of forgotten.
Yes, that is critical because I think that just the way our brains work and when we find ourselves in situations where we're experiencing some self-doubt, our attention goes to what we don't know. And even
Oh,
things that feel obvious aren't necessarily obvious in that moment because we're laser focused on this is
oh
hard for
yeah.
me or I might be doing it wrong. And so
Mm,
reminding people that you
mhm,
already have a set of skills that you use naturally in other environments is a great way to boost that confidence. And we're not
mhm.
telling you you have to relearn how to communicate, right? We're just suggesting that you may have to repurpose some of your skills a little bit more creatively or intentionally in the new
Yeah.
environment.
I think you could think about it as um, adjusting your grip on things that you can hold on to. Like sometimes when you pick up a new tool, you're looking at the tool, you're like, how do you use this thing? Um, and you sort of forget that your hand is holding it. And just think about holding the grip of a hammer, for instance. Um, there are better, like everybody knows how to hang onto a hammer, but there are better and worse ways to do that. So it might be just a small adjustment of your grip on this thing that you actually do have a hold of that thing. You can actually swing it, but adjust your grip a little bit, and things might go better. I have a question for you. Kim. So when people feel this sense of inadequacy, um, and they experience this sort of tunnel vision, like, and they're only looking at the thing they can't do, like, what kinds of things in your experience come up as like, this is a thing I can't do?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say a lot of it is informed by what they're seeing other people do. So if I'm in a
Oh.
meeting, for example, let's say I'm one of many squares, and there's someone else who's speaking very fluidly, somebody who seems very expert in the topic, that is going to trigger a lot of people's sense of, I don't know this topic well enough, or I can't deliver this message the way that they do. And so there must be something wrong with me, as opposed to I might deliver that differently, or
Hmm.
I'm not here
Hmm.
for the same reason that they are. And so a lot of it is sort of social comparison more than anything.
I do identify closely with that. The social dimension, the comparison dimension. I recently switched jobs. So I'm 52, I think, maybe 53, somewhere in there. And so you might think of this as like a mid to later career job switch. And that's a whole thing. It's a different thing than switching jobs when you're 24, right? So I found myself in a new division with I'm working with a new team, and I did struggle with unexpected imposter syndrome, because sometimes an institution or a new organization will have all these norms and things they take for granted, and you're like, what's everybody taking for granted here? I don't get it, and that quickly becomes, I also can't do it, and so I wouldn't describe the 20 years previously where I was in another college as, enduring a lot of imposter syndrome, quite the opposite. But in a new place, suddenly that really kicked in. And a lot of that involved like looking around, watching what other people are doing, wondering if I could do what they're doing. And, um, but I think on top of that, the technological and the digital adds another layer of I don't know, a question about your own competency. So I'm thinking about students who come into a basic media production course every semester, and so many of them are like, I don't know, I'm not very good at technology. Um, at a certain level, I know what they're talking about, but at another level, I am basically trying to, you know, help you do in this particular space what you've been doing all your life. Like whether that is in a newsletter or whether that's in a short video presentation or whether that's in a podcast. I want to help you do in this studio what you already know how to do. But a lot of people do experience the digital as just this kind of frightening, unsettling, can I do it sort of thing. So it's sort of like an overlay on our work culture and in our, organizational culture in general.
I agree with that. And I personally have struggled with that a lot too. And especially I have two boys that are roughly 10 and 15. One of them's about to turn 15. And they are so skilled, seemingly naturally in technology.
Hmm.
And it's just a
Hmm.
constant reminder of how far behind I am. And I think that if you let it, you can look around and see so many other people and think, oh, I just don't have the
Hmm.
technology skills that I need. And technology is growing and changing at such a rapid pace that we feel left
Yeah.
behind. And so I think what you're saying too is technology is a tool, but we already know how to communicate in many ways, right? We can always do better. But I think
Hmm.
in my mind, managing imposter syndrome is often about where you put your intention. And if your intention is always on what you don't know or where you don't measure up, then everything
Hmm.
is viewed through that lens,
Yeah.
as opposed
Yeah.
to at least balancing the scales a bit. You can still acknowledge that there are areas that you need to learn and prioritize what makes sense. I joke a lot that for years I kept telling myself, I'm not on TikTok, I'm a failure, as opposed to saying, you know what, I'm making a conscious choice to use
Yeah,
different
right,
platforms, right?
right, right.
So there's an acknowledgement that yes, there are tools I can uh, do more to learn
Mhm. Sure,
and I also have communication skills. I'm not
right,
starting from scratch.
right, right. Yeah, I think that's wisdom. And I think there's also like a word of grace in there as well. Like it is technologically an especially overwhelming time right now with the rise of large language networks. We're all wondering so many things about what AI is going to do to our workspaces and our personal lives. And so I think just giving yourself grace to say like, no, I know how to human. Like I'm a I'm a person. I've been a person for a while. I know how to do that. I have to figure out what does it mean to human in this particular kind of world that we find ourselves in. I love Ethan Mollick. He's a guru who talks about AI, and I cite him a lot. But he talks about being the human in the loop. And for me, that image sort of works that our job, our calling, you might say, is to stay human in whatever space we find ourselves in. And so I think for your listeners, like that should be a word of encouragement. Like, oh yeah, I actually do, I do know how to do that. I can do that.
I think that's a great way to put it. And I think that is such a powerful reminder that the human part we've been doing for a long time. The technology may be too new, but
I mean, honestly, I mean, now that I say that, I'm like, yeah, actually, I do suck at being a human sometimes too. So there's
no
that.
one's
But
perfect. But
yeah, but I at least know what I should be doing.
that's great. And I have a question for you too, and just out of curiosity, because you mentioned AI, and more and more people, myself included, have been experimenting with ChatGPT and some of the other tools as ways of maybe creating more efficiency around our communication. Do you see risks of using that? I mean, does it in any way undermine authenticity or connection? And like, it's very early to kind of predict what is going to happen, but on the
Mhm.
one hand, it's a great efficiency tool. On the other hand, I know that it can any tool that's overused can come with
Mhm.
consequences.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, of course, there are risks. There are with any emergent technology. I mean, 2,400 years ago, Plato was really worried about a new technology that had shown up, the pen. He was very concerned about the stylus. And so, like that's been the history of technology. And there are always affordances that come with it, and then there are challenges, and then there are losses too.
Mm.
With AI, I think like something I've been thinking about lately, like you said, I don't have this figured out, so this is not going to be a complete answer, but it may be suggestive. Some people think about it as primarily a tool. And so, for instance, when I'm writing an introduction to a podcast that's pretty formulaic, I kind of do this thing every week. Um, AI is a valuable tool there. It creates a trellis for my script,
Mhm.
and I can like quickly adapt it and adjust it and revise it into my voice. So that's more like a tool.
Mhm.
But then sometimes when I'm stuck, for instance, in the writing process, and I can't figure out how to position this thing I'm trying to say, I'm a writer, so I'm going to tend to use like writer examples. But you could probably translate this into other fields as well quite readily. If you were doing code or if you were trying to do some engineering work or whatever, then AI is a little bit more like a partner. It's
Mm.
more like a dialogue partner, and so I think we kind of shift back and forth between it's a tool, it's a partner, and both of those have real problems. If it's a tool, I think we might be underestimating how immersive it is. It's not just like, in a drawer somewhere.
Mm.
If it's a partner, there's this wonderful technologist, Jaron Lanier, who says that if we think of it as a person, it's easy to treat it like a god and to maybe begin to be too fearful about it or too reverential or too hopeful about it, any of those. we quickly begin to worship things. And so, yeah, he cautions about too much treating it like this other person at the table. So I'm looking for a third way to think about it. If you've got any ideas, Kim, I am super open to that. I think sometimes it's a tool, sometimes it's more like a partner, but I think both of those have real problems.
Yeah, I think that it's a really good way to frame it, and thinking about a third option is something for me to noodle on too.
Yeah, yeah. Let me know.
Yeah.
Let me know what you come up with. I'm thinking about a garden. I'm thinking about a shed. I'm thinking about, just like trying different sort of homey images to see if I can come up with something that might be more useful. I write this weekly work culture newsletter called The Mode Switch, and that's what I'm wrestling with for this week is like, what's another way to think about AI in the workplace? But anyway,
Yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah, well, you've given us a lot to think about in terms of especially the digital aspect of communication, because we're all in different phases of the journey. And I think we all come to every work interaction with different comfort levels, whether it's based on the topic, based on our own personality styles, introvert, extrovert, previous experiences that influence how we see the current moment. And so I think it's important, going back to what you were talking about before, of really being flexible in
Mhm.
how we show up in these
Mm,
different moments. One of the biggest challenges, I think, is that we tend to be in reactive mode. Oftentimes, we're moving at such a rapid pace that we're not consciously thinking about what we're doing. We're just sort of falling into old
mhm,
habits or just doing whatever feels most expedient. And so, I think even just consciously, I'm a big fan of pushing the pause button, especially if you feel uncomfortable, to kind of say, okay, how do I want to approach this, as opposed to just diving right into it. And it sounds like your book gives some really good guidance on how
mhm.
to do that.
I hope so. Yeah, I think of the image or the I don't know if it's an image, but it's like a piece of advice you're giving implicitly in what you're saying is like, don't just dive in.
Mhm.
There's a funny thing about ChatGPT, by the way, or AI in general, that for some reason, if you're like crafting something like a podcast script, like I do every week, they always say, "Let's dive in." And I think I don't know why that seems right to the large language networks all the time to use that verb dive in, but I think actually your advice to just let's let's take another look at this and ask like, how do I want to show up in this swimming pool? Um, is probably wisdom. So I think my book in effect is helping people. It's sort of giving permission to say you don't have to dive in. You can slow down, you can step back, you can sit down and think about this a bit. And I'm hoping that the stories and the insights from the 47 Gen Z and millennial professionals that I interviewed will afford that a chance to take a look around your life and not just be diving in.
Mhm. Well, that sounds like a really great place for me to transition into a question around your book and where people can find it and where people can find more of you. You mentioned a newsletter. I don't know if that's open to the public, but for people who want to continue to learn more about you and your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Two things. Thanks for asking, Kim. So, two things. Uh, I wish I had a more original answer than you can get the book Digital Overwhelm on Amazon very easily. Uh, but I have found it on other bookstores as well. So there are lots of online bookstores where you can pick up Digital Overwhelm, a mid-career guide for coping at work. But if getting another book right now feels like something, well, let me put that in my cart, but I'm not sure I'm quite ready to press the buy button yet. Thank you for putting it in your cart. I understand that. The stack of books next to my chair is way too tall, and sometimes I do need to like just put it in the cart and wait. But if that's you, then I would encourage you to stop by my newsletter. You can find it at The Mode Switch, all one word, themodeswitch.com, and that'll give you a place to sign up for it. It is free. and it comes out on a bi-weekly basis. There's a podcast attached to it, which involves an intergenerational team, a boomer, an Xer, millennial, Z, talking about these sort of work culture issues as well. So yeah, I would love for people to stop by themodeswitch.com and sign up. Happy to have you in the little community there.
I love that. That I will make sure that that is in the show notes as well. And thank you so much for being here, Craig. I really appreciate your sharing your research and your work with us. And I appreciate that you're doing that research. I think it's really important.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you for the encouragement. Some of my favorite podcasts are just like this, where you have an expertise and then I can say, all right, and here's a thing I've been researching, and we can try to make connections between the two. So it was good to talk about imposter syndrome and digital overwhelm. Thanks for that.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.